what a great pleasure it is to introduce Mike Pointer as our speaker today. These are the LITAC webinars on colour. I've known Mike Pointer a very, very long time. It feels like I've known you, Mike, all my working life. Probably I have. He's had a very distinguished career, a great career working at National Physical Laboratory. And even now, if people ask questions around standardization, I always say, well, the first person you should speak to is Mike Pointer. He's like the man who knows about standards. But he's also worked at other places, including, I think was it Tintometer, Mike? You worked for quite a long time.
Yeah, 2 years.
Yeah, and he's been associated with us. I mean, he's a visiting professor at Leeds University, but he's actually been associated with us as a group since our days at Derby University. So that certainly goes back more than 20 years, much more than 20 years. So it's a really great pleasure to have Mike speaking today. His topic is, I think, the effect of light on colour, which really intrigues me, actually, Mike. So I'm really looking forward to what you have to say. So if it's okay, I'll hand over to you and let you share your screen.
Yeah, don't you need to give me permission to share?
You should have permission. In Teams, it's more difficult with Zoom normally. If you go to the top right, there should be a share button.
Yeah. Share window.
Yeah, I normally share the whole screen, but because that means whatever's on your screen gets put onto our screen. But you can also share window, but share screen is normally the easiest thing to do. Yeah, I think that's working perfectly, Mike. So if you just make that full screen, that'd be great.
Okay. Thank you indeed for your introduction, Steve, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you from my study here in the city of Salisbury in the UK, where it's pouring with rain. I want to talk today about the impact of light on colour for a number of reasons, one of which is, as a colour scientist, you learn fairly early on in life that you can't have colour without light. And I want to demonstrate that because the next slide is a picture of a dark room. And here it is. Now, obviously it's a completely blank screen. And what I want to make you think about is that just think about what you're looking at. I'm telling you, it's a dark room and you're in that room, but what can you see? You can't see anything. Now, I'm going to tell you that there are objects in that room. There's a bowl of fruit, for example. And in your mind, you can see the colours of those fruit items, but you can't actually see the colours. Now, the reason you can't see the colours is there's no light. And of course, it begs the kind of philosophical question, do the objects themselves have a colour, or is the colour only manifest when the light is present and we see the reflected light from the objects? Well, that's for another time. But I'm just trying to impress on you the importance that light plays in what we see. Now, whether you're a colour scientist or whether you're an artist or a designer in textiles, in pottery or whatever, light is important to help the observer, the customer, whatever you want to call them, to perceive the colour. And so it's important that we understand this impact of light on colour. Now, I'll put you out of your misery and show you that's the picture of the room. And now we can see that there is light. There's some daylight coming in on the left here. There's two tungsten lamps here, and there's some lamps up here which are not lit, and there's probably some daylight on the right-hand side. And what we can see now are yellow vases. We can see some orangey coloured tulips, some white flowers, and a variety of fruit items. And we perceive them as coloured, but we need the light in order to gain this perception. Now, if we're interested in colour measurement, and I've talked about this in the seminars before, we have a number of standard light sources. We call them standard illuminants. And because everybody's eye is slightly different, we have a standard observer. That's an observer whose spectral responses are averaged and understood. And we have the ability to measure the reflectance of objects. And we can combine these three mathematical functions and we can compute what we call chromaticity coordinates, and we can plot them in these color maps called chromaticity diagrams, or we can generate and plot these coordinates in a three-dimensional space, CLAB uniform color space. The advantage of CLAB is the colors are approximately equidistant from each other in terms of perceptibility. Now this is all very well, but as David Wright was famous for saying many years ago, it doesn't actually tell us what the color looks like. And the reason for this is shown in this slide. This is traditional colorimetry. We take a light source, and if we wanted to be pedantic, we could use a spectroradiometer and measure the color of this light source. We shine it onto objects and we can measure their spectral reflectance. And if we knew the spectral responses of this observer's eyes, we could make some calculations. And what we're considering is the light from the light source reflected by the object perceived by the eye. And that's what colorimetry is all about. But actually, life is a bit more complicated than that, because not only is the light coming from the light source onto the object, but it's also probably incident in the observer's eye, especially in a scene, rather than looking at a simple small object. And so there's some light that directly coming into the observer's eye. So there's some transmission, if you like, along this line. But there's also the fact that not only is the light reflected from the sample into the observer's eye, but they're looking at that sample. And so they're influenced not just by the color they see, but by the specific object, but by the color of the whole environment. This is a very busy environment, but I think you can see that it is actually much more complicated. But without the light, we would not see that color at all. As I say, it's a complicated scene. There are many light sources. Now, we can divide the whole process into a number of boxes, if you like, and these have various names according to where you come from. If we take this scene here, which I have to say is a purely hypothetical scene, it is generated in a computer. We have our eyes connected to the brain, to the visual cortex, which is at the back of the brain here. And we can specify that we have a lit scene, we have our eyes, we have the visual cortex, and usually we have some response. If we're driving a car, we respond to a red traffic light and stop the car, the motor response to put our foot on the brake pedal. If we're in a store going to buy a product, we go through exactly the same process, but we make a decision. Do we pick that product off the shelf or do we walk on? It's a motor response that requires us to do something. Now, if we're vision scientists, we might talk about a stimulus that evokes a sensation. A sensation is how the eye responds. Now, the eye then passes signals to the brain, and the brain interprets those sensations. So the sensation may be a response in one of our cones, the color receptors of the eye, but a perception of that sensation is to say that's red. And then cognition says, well, hey, it's a bit more than that. That's more than just red. It's a red traffic light. And then the action is to put our foot on the brake. And so we can measure the stimulus. It's a physical measurement. We can take an instrument. It might be spectroradiometer, it might be a colorimeter, it could be a number of things. And we can generate, as I've already described, some CIA colorimetry. But what we're really interested in is what is the color appearance? What's the relationship between what we see and what we recognize? We perceive the red jacket. How do we respond to it? And then there's the expectation, the emotion, the preference, the response. There are so many areas that we could, words we could use to describe this relationship between the cognition and the action. And these are becoming increasingly more researched, and because they're increasingly important. Now, I want to take this presentation now into three headings. We're going to talk about light measurement very quickly, and this is not going to get too technical. I'm going to demonstrate some visual effects, and then I want to talk about a number of scenarios where we hit real lighting. And these are just a collection of pictures that I want to try and help you to think through how important the lighting is. And I'm just going to give you my view, but you'll have other views depending on where you're coming from. So if we go out and buy a lighting product today, a lamp, by law, there is a specific set of parameters that have to be recorded on the box. They have to record the lumen output of the lamp. And you might say, well, what on earth does this mean? I'll describe in a minute. The number of watts is the amount of electrical power that has to be put into the lamp in order to generate this lumen output. And then efficacy is a measure of the ability, if you like, the number of lumens per watt, the energy transfer factor, if you like, that the lamp is capable of. And we'll talk about just a little bit about that in a minute. Now, in terms of the color of the lamp, because we have to understand, and again, I'll demonstrate this, that different lamps have different colors. This number, the color rendering index, I'm not going to talk about anymore because that could be the subject of another presentation. But it's a number on a scale of 0 to 100, and 82, in my view, is not very good. It's certainly not something you would want to work under or live under at home, except perhaps for tungsten lighting. Now, the other thing they quote is the color temperature. It's here, correlated color temperature, and that is a measure of the light, the color of the light. And essentially, we can divide the colors of lamps from warm to cold and whitish in the middle. And these have a number here relating to the equivalent color temperature. It's on a rather odd scale, but it relates to the color of the lamp. And I'll demonstrate that again in a minute. So light output, the luminous flux is the amount of energy that is emitted by the lamp in 1 second. So we have our lamp and it's emitting light, and every second it's emitting a certain amount of flux, and we measure that in lumens, and that's an SI unit. It's an international standard lumen unit, the lumen. And the light is instant onto a surface. This is the surface we want to illuminate. And the luminous intensity is the amount of light which is coming out of the source per solid angle. Now, a solid angle is perhaps a difficult concept, but it's a three-dimensional, a two-dimensional angle. Instead of just saying it's a cone of light coming in this direction, it's actually a cone which rotates round, and so it's a solid cone in 3 dimensions. And so the luminous intensity is the luminous flux per unit solid angle, and that's what this says. It's measured in candelas, and the candela is also an SI unit. And so 1 lumen in this unit is 1 candela per steradian by definition. But of course, we look at this light, and so we have to go on a little bit further. Now, what we're interested in is these 2 units here. The illuminance is the amount of luminous flux per unit area. That's the amount of this quantity, the luminous flux, falling on a specified area. It's measured in lux, and 1 lux is 1 lumen per square meter. So that says the lamp is emitting enough light to illuminate 1 square meter. And when that light is a lumen, that is 1 lux. And you can buy meters which measure this, and it's a very important measurement in the lighting world. But luminance is the one perhaps we're more interested in, because it's the intensity of the light from a surface in a given direction as seen by the eye. And this takes into account the visual response of the eye. And it's measured in candelas per meter squared. And sometimes there are other units here, especially in America, they use this unit, the nit, but they don't seem to be able to move on to candelas per meter squared. But the important thing to remember in the real world is that the illuminance is the amount of light falling on a surface, and the luminance is the amount of light reflected by the surface seen by the eye. And they're the 2 measurements that you'll come across most of all. Now, the color temperature is a wee bit more complicated. I suppose you thought that was complicated enough. But if you take the chromaticity diagram, this is the Planckian locus here, the locus of Planckian radiators, which I've talked about in the past. And here it is plotted in a slightly different diagram. But these chromatistas that fall on this line have an associated color temperature. And so the very warm lamps here, this is the line of 2500 Kelvin. This is the line here of typical daylight of 6000 Kelvin. And it's these numbers are used to associate the color of the lamp, as I said earlier. Now, there is another measure which is becoming more use, which we'll just come to in a minute, but this is an example of real lamps. I admit this picture is computer generated, but a set of lamps with different color temperatures. You can see a lamp of 1,000 color temperatures is very warm, a lamp with 10,000 is very cold. And typical daylight comes in the middle at 6,500. And the unit is the degree Kelvin. And if we're interested in spectral power distributions, and that's the amount of relative radiant power coming from a source as a function of wavelength, the warmer the color temperature, the more red light there is relative to blue light. And so 20,000 Kelvin is very cold. It has a lot of blue light compared with red light, whereas 5,000 Kelvin here is almost balanced in red and blue light. The other measurement that is becoming well used in the world of color, understanding color, is what's called DUV. Not a very good name, but that's how it is. It's the distance. If you measure the chromaticity of a lamp and plot it on this diagram, it's the distance of the point from the Planckian locus. And obviously, if you go up here, the lamps become greener. If you go down here, they become more magenta. And this is seen as not a good thing. And so this measure, the length of this line, is quite an important measure on the acceptability, the color rendering capability of a light source. Now, we talked about luminous efficacy. I mentioned luminous efficacy, and it's an interesting slide because this shows the luminous efficacy. That's the lumens output per watt of electrical energy in, as a function of years, 1940 to the year 2020. And you can see that the incandescent lamp down here, started off way back at the beginning of the previous century, and its light output didn't increase very much over the years because basically it's so fundamental that it's very difficult to improve it. The only difference that was made was to introduce the halogen into the lamp and run the lamps hotter but smaller, and that increased the light output by a small amount. In fact, a very, very significant amount at the time. Now, other light sources that we could come across, these are high intensity discharge lamps, mercury vapor lamps, etc. And there have been a number of these over the years, but low wattage ones have a higher efficacy because for a given amount of power, they do give out more light. And I'll show you some examples later on. Higher wattage lamps became even more efficient in terms of efficacy. And these are the traditional fluorescent lamps. They're somewhat in between the two, but you can see that their efficacy, their efficiency, if you like, converting electrical into light energy is much higher than the tungsten lamp. But then we come to these two curves, and these are LEDs. And you can see that in the last 20 years, the advent of LEDs has increased the efficacy enormously. And this is something that it won't go on indefinitely, because one of the problems with LEDs is the more power you put into them, the hotter they get. And we all know how hot tungsten lamps can get, but to have an LED get very hot creates a few problems because the way LEDs are made, it requires soldering or welding within the lamp. And if you make them too hot, the solder weld melts, and so they break down. And so there are limits, but you can see that the efficacy, the amount of light per input power is enormous compared with earlier light sources. And this is an OLED panel, which we're seeing more and more. OLED screens exist in cameras, and your phone has probably got an OLED screen, but there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't make a panel which is just essentially like the screen of your camera of your phone when you turn it into torch mode, and put that panel on the wall, and it provides illumination. And this will undoubtedly happen. The big flexibility of OLEDs is you can make them flexible, and so they can bend around corners, and they're relatively cheap to make. Okay, now what we're actually going to talk about, what we are talking about, is color rendering. I want to give you a formal definition of color rendering and then forget all about it. But I thought I ought to show that I'm a scientist and put a formal definition in. The definition of color rendering, the ability of a light source to render the colors in a scene or of an object, is the effect of that light source on the perceived color of objects by conscious or subconscious comparison with their perceived color under a reference illuminant. Now, this is not the place to argue this, but I have a lot of trouble with this definition because if you take 10 people and ask them what the perceived color of an object is, they might give you 10 answers. And so it makes defining a quantity called color rendering rather difficult. Now, modern day terminology does tend to mix terms in this field, and you often find what traditionally is called color rendering, now called color fidelity. And the reference there is to the International Lighting Vocabulary of the CIE, and that's the number of the term. And you can see the International Lighting Vocabulary is freely available on the CIE website. But this is example, this is the same scene illuminated by 2 lamps. And you might say to yourself, well, this lamp is actually rendering the colors more acceptably to my impression of what they should look like than this one. But hey, these may be unripe bananas, these may be unripe tomatoes, and it may be that this is a fairer representation. And so light sources can fool you. And well, that's just a statement you have to accept, which is why really what the purpose of this talk is to help us to think more about the light source and its importance. So that's light measurement out of the way. We'll cut the physics now and we're going to move on to a bit of psychophysics. I want to demonstrate to you a number of visual effects that affect the way we see color. And while I'm talking, I'd like you to stare at that black dot here in the center of the screen. Okay, don't deviate from that black spot, just stare at that black spot. Now, while you're doing that, the retina, that's the part of your eye which is sensitive to light. It contains rods and cones, and we'll think about the cones. 3 cone types: red sensitive, green sensitive, and blue sensitive in rough terminology. And according to the area of the retina where this image is focused, the sensitivities of those cones are changing. So where your retina is seeing red, it's lowering the sensitivity to red light. Where it's green, it's lowering the sensitivity to green light. And please, while I'm talking, continue to look at the black dot. Where it's blue, it's lowering the sensitivity to blue light. Now, down here, this is cyan, this is green and blue, so it's lowering the sensitivity to green and blue light. Magenta is red and blue, and it's lowering the sensitivity to red and blue light. And yellow is red and green, and it's lowering the sensitivity to red and green light. So all the time you stare at that dot, different parts of your retina are selectively changing their spectral response. Now, what I'm going to do in a minute is put up a blank screen. And just continue looking at that black dot, and here comes the blank screen. Now, what I hope you can see is in the area up here, it should look cyan. This should look magenta. This should look yellow. This should look blue. This should look green. And this should look red. It's not working for me because I haven't been staring at the black dot, but I hope it's worked for you. And that is an example of what we call chromatic adaptation. It's a physiological effect. It's a real effect. And your eye is doing this all the time. Now, let's just demonstrate a little bit more. If you look at the central spot, you should still see the colors. If by the end of the talk, any of you are still seeing the colors, I'm very sorry, but it will go away eventually. It should go away in the next 5 minutes. So you have 3 cone types, and they have sensitivities. The long wave ones look like this, the medium wave look like this, and the short wave look like that. These are typical. They're not specific. They're typical. And what's happening is where we looked at the red light, sorry, where we looked at the cyan, the green and the blue are lowered. There's two ways of looking at this. One, you can say this is amplified, and one way this is detracted. But what happened here was suppressed green and blue relative to red. Where we looked at the magenta, we suppressed red and blue relative to green. And where we looked at yellow, we suppressed red and green relative to blue. And so all the time, your eye is looking at these colors in that particular part of the retina and changing its spectral response in proportion to the amount of the color there. Now, obviously, you're completely unaware that this happens, but it does. And I've just forced it to happen by looking at those specific saturated colors. Now, how does this work in practice? Well, there's a picture of a young lady, which I admit I pinched off the web, and I hope that you will see a picture of a Caucasian female, lit in perhaps rather a peculiar manner. The light source appears to be quite warm, but I think in your mind, you're associating the color of her skin as being Caucasian. And so you have you've made a specific response to this picture. And if you stared at it long enough, and I'm not going to let you do that because we haven't time, but if you stared at it long enough, you would find that eventually you would see her skin as being quite natural. Now, in fact, the picture could look like that. That's the same lady in the same position, but illuminated by daylight. And you can see now it looks less warm. There's a blue tinge on the right-hand side, but again, you find it very acceptable. And that's because the eye is, in this process of chromatic adaptation, is attempting to discount the illuminant. The effect is called discounting the illuminant. And it's a more generic term, if you like, for chromatic adaptation. It's looking at a scene and it's saying, the illuminant is this, but I don't want that illuminant to influence me, and so I'm going to hit a balance. Now, a pertinent question might be, what is the balance? What is the mid-range? And you know that has never been answered. It's possibly, and I'll show you why in a minute, at about 5,500 Kelvin. That's the whitest light source you can get. Anything higher in color temperature, that appears bluish, and anything lower appears orange or reddish. But it's not a proven point. That's what the two pictures look like side by side. And yeah, they're different, but in isolation, they both appear acceptable. Now, this appears perhaps a little bit more extreme, but that's my eldest daughter and one of my granddaughters. And I think intuitively, although this picture has got this horrible orange cast on it, you know that this Eliza here is wearing a white hat with a white scarf, and that these teeth are white in Alison's mouth. There's an instinctive knowledge of this. And so what your brain is trying to do is to drive its perception of this image such that this does appear white, and this appears white, and that the flesh looks quite normal. Now, it's not a very acceptable picture because I've generated it to make an extreme. What the picture actually looks like is that, and it is exactly the same picture. It's just I put the orange cast, and this up here is actually real because there's some glitter in her hat, but you can see what the color really is, if you like. But in isolation, this is not an unacceptable scene. And later on, I'll show you some scenes that you look at, real scenes, where the light might look like this, and you completely discard it. You just don't notice it. This comes off the web, but this is perhaps a little bit more extreme. But this guy here has got a nasty cyan cast, and here he's got a nasty red cast. And if you look at this picture, this color here and this color here, and isolate it down here, so you create a patch which is digitally the same as this patch, and digitally here the same as this patch, you find these two are actually the same digital values. And that's because you've discounted the illuminant. And what you're seeing is actually very similar within a few bits. And what the picture actually looks like is this. And then finally, perhaps the more extreme, This is not a very good picture, you might say, but what is it? It's a picture of strawberries, probably on a white plate with a little bit of a cyan cast. Now, here's the thing. You see this point here in the image. Well, if you pick up that point in the image, it's got digital values of 154, 166, and 168, which are very, very similar. They're certainly not red dominant. In fact, the red is the lowest of the three, and the CLAB values have very low A star, B star, which means that this is almost a neutral color. And yet it appears red. And that's because the cyan has lowered our sensitivity to green and blue, or alternatively raised our sensitivity to red. And so we build in this balance, as it were, and we have the effect of what we call color constancy. Color constancy is a bit of a funny effect because it's a combination of chromatic adaptation, discounting the illuminant, and it's termed color constancy, and there's quite a lot of research done about it, but it's quite difficult to draw inferences from the research because partly because people don't always do the same experiments, but partly because we're relying on a visual response. Now, the interesting thing is, and there's no cheating here, what I'm going to do now is take away the picture, but I'm going to leave this box and leave this arrow. And what color is the arrowhead? It's neutral. And so it should be, because these values up here, these digital values, are nearly neutral. And so if you take the image away, you see it immediately looks red. You take the image away, it immediately is neutral, and that's what it is. And so this effect of what we see is heavily dependent on our interpretation of the illuminant. All things are not equal, and I just want to talk a little bit about metamerism. I think I've talked about it before, but it is such an important effect. These three people here are in a graphic arts house. They're used to printing ink on paper. They've got a standard illuminant here, which is probably D50, and all three of them are looking at the color reproduction on proof sheets or maybe press sheets. And the point to bear in mind is that the responses of the cone types in these three people will be different. They might be very similar, they might not, but the important point is they will be different. And there's a guy called Yuta Asano who worked with Mark Fairchild at Rochester Institute of Technology in Rochester, New York. And he measured a number of people, a very high number of people. And this is one of his sets of data. These show the color matching functions for all of these observers. And what it's showing is the range of values. And so all observers are not the same. And in color matching sense, that means that they would require different amounts of red, green, and blue light to match a given stimulus. And that is important. We call it observer metamerism. And unfortunately, life is not all that simple in terms of metamerism, because there's also such a thing as illuminant metamerism. Sorry, this picture is so unsharp, but it's a very small picture, but it's the best picture to show the results. These are two bits of fabric in a viewing booth illuminated by fluorescent lamps. And I think you can see that under daylight fluorescent lamps, these two pieces of fabric look identical. If we go to a much warmer linear, in fact, a warm white fluorescent lamp, they look very different. One looks greenish and one looks brownish. And this is all to do with the amount of red light that is being reflected by the sample. There's more red light here. More red light being reflected, it's stimulating the red cones more, and so these do look different. We call this illuminant metamerism. So two things that match under one illuminant might not match under another, and here's an explanation. There's a spectral power distribution of daylight and of tungsten light, and we may have two neutral samples, and they might look, sorry, two orange samples, they might look the same under the daylight, like this, but under tungsten lighting, they mismatch. And that's purely because the combination of this spectral power distribution and this spectral reflectance here comes up with the same tristimulus values, but here has different tristimulus values. And there's a thing called the metamerism index to measure this, but don't worry about that. The important point is that it exists. And is it important? Yes, it is, because imagine you want to go out and buy a suit. Man or woman, it doesn't matter. You want to go buy a suit. If a suit is mass produced, there's just every possibility that the fabric that makes the jacket and the fabric that makes the skirt came from a different dye house. And if these two fabrics do not match under a wide variety of illuminant, you could end up with a jacket that matched the skirt or a jacket that matched the trousers in one light source, daylight, for example. But if you went into a artificial light source, they might not match. Now you say, oh, it's ridiculous, that doesn't happen, but it did. In the early days of, in the later days of fluorescent lamps, Philips brought out a lamp which had the designation TL84. And Marks and Spencer, with one of the big high street retail chains in this country, put TL84 lamps into a number of their stores. And the reason they did it was because the efficacy was better than any lamp they were using. And all they needed to do was put new tubes in their fluorescent lamp fittings. So they were getting more light, or in fact the equivalent amount of light, for less energy, so it was cheaper. But they found that it created a metamerism effect, that they were having skirts or trousers which didn't match the jackets under TL84, but did match under daylight. So as the store got darker, as the day moved on, they put the lights on, boom, the match broke down. And this was real. It caused a lot of problems, and there are ways around it, but it caused a lot of problems, but it is real. So metamerism is real. And now let's talk about real lighting, and the rest of the lecture is going to be just going through slides talking about real light situations. We'll start with daylight, because daylight is something we just take for granted. I've already shown you a similar slide to this, but this shows the phases of daylight as the sun has different positions in the sky, a very low level sun, very high level sun. The color temperature changes, and this is an example of the most white, the most neutral, if you like, is about 5,500 Kelvin. But as I say, there's, to my knowledge, there's not much work, if any, that actually proves that point. The interesting thing is, in the old days of photography using film, which I come from, daylight film was always balanced to be neutral at 5,500 Kelvin. And I was never able to know, we never found out why that was so, but it was a good figure to use. So we have low color temperature, high color temperature, warm lamps, cold lamps, and in the middle here somewhere is entirely neutral. Now, on a bright sunny day, of course, the sky appears blue. And this is St Ives in Cornwall, and it's a brilliant sunny day. I took the picture, and the sky looks blue because the wavelength of light coming into the atmosphere is scattered according to 1 over lambda to the 4. And so lower wavelengths of light scatter more than high wavelengths. And so the sky appears blue because you're looking at the blue scattered light. And the sea appears blue because it's reflecting this skylight. And you see this is bright and it's a very high color temperature. But equally, if you have a cloudy day, the colour temperature has dropped. This is Criccieth in North Wales, where I'm going next week. And you've got much more diffusion, so you don't have the blue sky. You've got all wavelengths of light showing diffusion. The colour temperature has dropped, and you get a general much more muted effect, lower colour temperature. This is a picture of sunrise. So you've got light coming through the atmosphere here. Here we're getting quite a lot of scatter, and as the light is more overhead, get less scatter, and only the blue light is scattered. And just making the point that there's quite a range of color temperatures in daylight. And sunset can be the opposite effect. We often get red skies at night because the light is now traveling through more of the atmosphere, and we're seeing scatter of red light as well as blue light. And this is a picture. This is not near where I live, but you can get a situation where you can get the entire spectrum in the light. So it looks reddish here, through greenish and bluish here. And this is to do with the sun being overhead. This picture was taken at about midday. So the sun is up the top here somewhere, and the light down here is passing through more atmosphere, and so you're seeing different scattering according to the angle of incidence. And it is, just for interest, that's the spire there of Salisbury Cathedral. Now, let's talk a little bit more about artificial light and public spaces to start with. This is a sort of area that we tend to just take for granted, but it is important. This is it's a snow scene, but this lighting here is high pressure sodium lighting, which we don't see so much of now, but high pressure sodium lighting became very important in the 60s and 70s for street lighting, for a very simple reason. It's cheap. You've got a lot of light out for not much electrical power in. Its color rendering, of course, is abysmal, because it just radiates light at one wavelength, the wavelength of sodium discharge, 5896 angstroms, 589.6 nanometers. So that's the only power you've got, so you get very poor color rendering. And although you might guess that's a red truck there, it might not be, but you certainly can't see the green foliage, and of course the white snow looks orange. The next progress in street lighting was towards high intensity discharge lights, which use a mercury vapor, and these have mercury vapor has more discharge lines in it. It's still a line source, and so you get a much colder reflectance, illuminance, and that's what you see here. But you're paying a price, because the energy required to produce this is higher. Just think about what the goal of, there's a car headlamp here, incidentally, this is not the light source. The goal of street lighting is to provide even illumination, and by and large it doesn't do a very good job, because the street furniture, the lampposts, are such that they're separated out, and you're going to get high intensity near the bottom of here and low intensity in between the lampposts. The other thing about a lot of earlier light sources is half the light is wasted because it goes up to the sky, and so it doesn't illuminate road at all, which really shows very bad design. Now, these are LED lamps, and you can see first this is on a road junction, which is quite important to illuminate. Interesting sky color, but you can see the area of illumination here is much more uniform, and hence this could be regarded as better illumination. And although these look very much like spot lamps, they're LED lamps, and so they contain clusters of LEDs, and these do tend to give much more even illumination, which is ideally what you want. So even in something as mundane as street lighting, there has to be design, there has to be rationale, there has to be reason. And of course, there are legal standards as to what levels of illumination are required in certain circumstances. Now, this is the ultimate street lighting. I put this in because it's one of the things that interests me. This is Singapore, the island of Singapore. It's got this wonderful hotel here, which has the restaurant is across here, across the three buildings. But this is the Singapore Grand Prix. And the illumination specification for this Grand Prix route is amazing. The uniformity of the lighting is a requirement is just amazing, because it has to appear to the drivers like daylight, such that at no point are they confused by shadows, are they confused by unwanted illumination or glare into their eyes. So these street circuits are becoming even more popular. The oldest one, of course, is Monaco, but in southern France, but Singapore do a brilliant job here. Public spaces we're talking about, this is the forecourt of King's Cross, some of you may have been there, and this is a very clever lighting design, because it relies during the day on daylight, and although it has this canopy, the use of daylight lighting this area is really quite clever. Obviously you get shadows of the grid here, but the actual general use of light in a public space here, I think this is really quite clever. But of course you have to ask the question, what do you do at night? And they have introduced these purple, call them what you will, LED lights, and also some hidden lighting in the trough here, and it still works. It still does work. Obviously, the other thing is you have to be able to read the indicators. The indicators are orange at the moment, and you can see that there's some reflection of this purple light off that, but that's probably because the picture was taken from the balcony, and most people view the indicators from down here. But that's an example of where you have to think very carefully about a lighting design. What are the requirements here? Well, the requirements are firstly that people be able to see these indicators, but they're very bright. But secondly, that they don't have such a low level of illumination here that they walk into each other. And so there's a hazard here that has to be avoided. And you can see that in some places, the level of illumination is actually quite low. But then there's a lot of spill lighting coming from the line of shops here, and there's actually shops up here too. And so although the lighting area is complex, it is acceptable. Now, I would say to you, if you've ever been to King's Cross, and some of you may have been, because it's the station that Leeds trains come into, have you ever thought about the lighting? And my guess for many of you, the answer is no. So next time you go there, think about the lighting, especially if it's in the evening or early in the morning and the lighting is on. Think about the many types of lighting there are. There's lighting in the trough here, but there's lighting up here too. And there's this orange light, which is being reflected from somewhere. Think about the lighting level down here. Think about the lighting here. Think about the lighting coming from the shops. It's a very complex scene, but somebody designed this and it's important. Let's look at buildings now. This is a personal grudge here. This is a floodlit building. It's actually the Parliament building in Budapest. It's on the Pest side of the river. And to my mind, it's one of the finest examples of building illumination that I've ever seen. And I say those words carefully because I've actually been there and seen it like this, the CIA meeting. And it is the final example I've ever seen. There might be better examples, it's just I haven't seen them. The amount of light being poured on this building and the evenness of it is quite amazing. And it makes it quite spectacular. And you can see that the building is typical white stone during the day, but during the night, they've given this orange tinge, and it actually contrasts very nicely with the night sky, and it really does look fantastic. This, I think, is a classic example of poor lighting. I have no idea where it is. Well, what I should say is I can't remember where it is, but it's been lit by individual luminaires along here, which are attempting to light the pillars. And yet up here in the trough on this ledge, they've lit with a completely different color temperature, and here over the door, which to my mind is bizarre. So again, when next time you're out and you see floodlit buildings, think about it. Think about whether you like it. Think about whether you regard it as good lighting. Think about whether you regard it as adequate color rendering. In terms of discounting the illuminant and chromatic adaptation, you'll struggle here, because what is the illuminant? You can see two, and they're very different. This, to my mind, is an example of the worst lighting of buildings. I have an axe to grind here because our cathedral in Salisbury is lit like this. It's got a lot of individual light sources, and it looks to me like a building which has been lit with a lot of individual torches. And the lighting is very harsh, the lighting is very cold, and although it's a white building, there are parts of the building which aren't lit at all. The shadows here, the shadows here, these splendid columns here are completely unlit. And what do we see here? Well, I'm making comments about what we see in terms of the building, but that's what we're interested in. And the light at night has to enhance the building. The only thing I think that's reasonably well lit are these pillars down here, because we see the structure of the pillar, and I think that's good. Now let's move on to another area, and that's the sports lighting. Sports lighting actually is much more important than people think, because you need, in this game of football, to illuminate this huge area uniformly. And there's a number of ways of doing this. You can either do it with lots of light, as they've got here, banks of light, but only from either side, or you can do it with big pillars with lots of light on in the corners. But the key danger of doing that is that every player has 4 shadows, because the lamp here, the lamp here, the lamp here, and the lamp here creates a shadow. And so as the player runs down the field, he carries 4 shadows with him. The advantage of doing it like this is that the shadows can be removed and you do not create shadows. You've got so many light sources, the shadows merge one into the other. Now, this sort of lighting has to be sensitive to TV cameras. Fortunately, TV cameras now are very, very easily able to adjust to different lighting color temperatures and different light levels. But the more light you can pump on here, the happier the TV companies are, because it makes their job so much easier. This is almost artificial daylight. I have to say, this is very good lighting. The color of the lighting is to make, in this instance, it look very similar to daylight, and you probably find that acceptable. Another good example is of tennis. This is the no, it isn't. It used to have a picture of the O2 Arena in London, but this is an example of having to light a big area. But, and there are more criteria here, in that the illumination has to be even over the court, but you can't have light shining in all these officials that sit round the court looking into this bright light. And so you have to be very careful how you light this. And again, it's lit for television, of course, and these big screens that they use, and of course television cameras here. And so again, it's something we go to, it's something we accept. And do we discount the illuminant when we look? Yes, we do, because we probably don't think about it. Let's talk about retail. Retail lighting is quite fun. I challenge you to go to a retail mall and look at the different types of lighting. Look at the different types of lighting here. We've got this lighting here, fairly high color temperature. We've got this very funny lighting here and here, much colder. And yet we've got an overall glow, which is fairly high level. And I would say in a mall, that's it's overall warm lighting. And in a shopping mall, that's typical. This is a different type of shop. This is a ladies' makeup shop. And, well, perhaps I shouldn't say ladies, it's a makeup shop. It could be for men. It's very white, but it's very bright, because this enhances the contrast between the colour of the makeup and put on the skin and the colour of the surround. And it's fairly even, although there's some nasty shadows here off the very glossy floor. And I wonder if the lighting designer thought about that, because these could be quite obtrusive into the scene. This is an aisle in a supermarket. The goal of a supermarket is to stack it high and sell them quick. And so what supermarkets tend to do is to pile a lot of light on the scene so that you see what you want, you pick it up and you take it, because that's the goal, to move the product fast. Sometimes in this sort of area, the lighting is different. The general lighting up here might be of a defined good high efficacy, but then they'll use spot lighting here to highlight the fruit and the vegetables, such that it enhances the appearance of ripeness, and they're allowed to do that. And so they can actually say they're selling fresh produce because they've used the light to enhance the view. So if you go and buy in this sort of situation, have a look at the lighting. And the real difficult one is lighting meat. It's very easy to use special lamps, especially in these days of tunable LEDs, to light these cabinets with lamps which enhance the redness of meat. And red meat looks fresher, it's more attractive to the customer, and they're more likely to buy. So you need to be careful. Lighting is important. Another example of a retail store in a shopping mall, it's open fronted. And this is encouraging people not to go in and grab and buy, but to go in and linger. Because the owners of the store want you to linger. They want you to buy more than one item. They want you to look at the items. They want you to be satisfied. They want you to have an ambiance about you that says, this is good, this is quality. And note how they've set out the clothes here in this order. That enhances the variable of colour. It's saying to the customer, colour is important. And look, we can correlate it with the trousers. And we thought about this, and we're trying to make you feel comfortable so that you buy. That's just to a much more extent throwing the items onto the hangers. And I'm not saying this won't sell, it will, but it's not as professional. It's just broad lighting compared with the previous slide. Now, this is a warehouse. Does it matter what the color is in a warehouse? Probably not. And so we use, I suspect these are LEDs, but traditionally these would be high intensity discharge lights. You don't need many of them. You get a uniform illumination, which makes it safe. Health and safety kicks in here. And you would use this not just in warehouses, but you would use this in do-it-yourself stores, which are really warehouses with shelves in them, and use it in big supermarkets, which again, just warehouses with shelves in them. They're relatively cheap, they give good illumination, and we don't worry about the color. Another example is the forecourt petrol stations at night. The reason that you want a high level illumination here is to stop people coming in and going without paying. It's a much safer arrangement, and it also makes their CCTV cameras work much more efficiently. But look how many light sources there are, relatively few for this huge area, and it's very even illumination. So it's a really good lighting design. Fashion. We love the catwalk, and some of you may have experienced this. We love the catwalk. The audience in darkness, what are they going to see? They're going to see the people walking up and down the catwalk, and they're going to see even illumination, and that's good. And so when people walk down the catwalk, they don't see any shadows to the side. There are only shadows for one up, and the shadows would be distracting, and we don't want them. Photography is obvious. We want even illumination. We use the blue to make the light appear colder. These could be tungsten, they could be LED lamps these days, but again, artificially we make a uniform back, and we're not aware, but the photographer is very much aware of the light, the distribution and the color of the light here. Getting to the end now, we talk about exhibitions. There are a number of ways of lighting exhibitions. This is an exhibition where every item has been discreetly lit. So as you walk around, you go from black, dark to lit. Here's one where you've got a mixture of spotlights on lighting and general lighting. And here's one where you've just got very low, I don't think it's particularly well lit, but you've got an overall illumination here, but the pictures themselves are not very evenly illuminated. And here we've just got flood the room with light. And for these particular pictures, it looks splendid. It looks like a big area with these bold colors because it's lit in this way. Did I say anything about the color of the light? No, because in my viewing of the pictures, I've discounted it. Even in this situation, I've discounted it. There might be an orange glow, but it kind of enhanced the oil paintings here. Exhibition stands. We use different colors to enhance the view of the different products, and we use general illumination. I think this is messy. I don't think this is good. The mixture of colors here is not good, but you can see how lighting on an exhibition stand might draw people in, should draw people in. This is clever. It draws people in. It makes you different from the next stand. TV studios obviously need even illumination. Obviously, the illumination has to be balanced to the cameras, and they are very good at doing that. There's another example of a TV studio using LED panels now. Office lighting. This is an example of good illumination. Daylight's being used in the distance where it can be, and just overhead lighting. As long as you don't sit in your shadow, this is good, but the position of the light source over the desk is important. There's mixed lighting here again. Good lighting overhead, some panel lighting here. It's a little bit obtrusive. Conference rooms are often very badly lit. This one's got blinds, which is quite important. But if this were a bright sunny day and the sun were coming in those windows, you'd have to use the blinds because the people sitting along this side of the desk would be looking into a glare source, and that's not a good thing to do. I think this is a well-designed conference room. It's got very careful lighting. It's been thought about. Color, is it important? Probably not. It's another example of workplace lighting, using these huge lamps to give plenty of light on the workstations, but using daylight as well. That's important because daylight is free. Hospital lighting, again, clinical, usually about 4,000 Kelvin, although this looks a bit higher. operating theatres, wards, etc. They tend to have a lot of light because it's important. But if you're trying to diagnose a patient, especially a patient with something wrong with their skin, the use of the correct lighting is important. And I've met medics who don't understand that. That's a horrible picture, but it's an operating theatre where they use very high intensity, but often localized light. Hotel lighting, this is the last one, I think. A hotel room should invite you in. It should feel warm. And so very often they will put the lamps on of lower color temperature in the daylight to give you that warm feeling that you've come home, that you're going to feel good here. This is even better still, especially with the view. Again, it feels warm, it feels cozy, it feels comfortable. Use of lower color temperature. And lastly, restaurants. This is a fast food restaurant. They want you in, they want you out. So we use highlights, relatively cool. We lower the color temperature. You're more likely to sit and linger. You're more likely to spend a bit more money. Decorative lighting, lower color temperature, looks good, makes you feel you're in a good situation. It's a nice place to be. Even better, it's cooler. It's warmer. It's more an evening atmosphere, and again, it makes you want to linger. But the food here is well lit, and that's an important thing. We don't like looking at plates of food that we can't see. And lastly, domestic. You could say a lot about domestic lighting, but this looks warm, cozy, low. It's using the daylight, no curtains here at all, probably blinds. Kitchen area, health and safety, got to have plenty of light, but look at the colours. Some different colours coming in here, and there's some nasty reflections off the cupboards at the back there. Now these are just 4 rooms to finish with. This one is warm, it's fairly bright, colours look good under the light source. This looks cold, sharp, crisp, not really right for a bedroom scene. This looks more pastel, still looks cold, but is more pleasant than the white walls. This looks hard, really hard. Maybe if the room's big, you can take these bold colours. I'm not saying any of these are good or bad. I'm merely saying how important colour and light is in your perception of this room. It's the same room. And that brings me to an end. And I've just got 2 more things to show you. And this is a very old demonstration that was put together by my father-in-law, Robert Hunt. And I want you to look at the yellow cushion. The yellow cushion, it looks yellow because yellow is reflecting red and green light and absorbing blue light. And what we've done is cut out a piece of cyan filter, and cyan filter absorbs green and blue light. So when you put cyan over the yellow, it actually looks green because it's absorbing the blue light and the red light, and so it looks green. But if you put that cyan filter over the whole slide, you get that. And now immediately we noticed that the girl's wearing a white blouse, and we've made it white. Our brain has made it white, and that changes the balance of the picture such that the cushion looks yellow. But physically, the cushion here is the same as the cushion here. And I can tell you it has the same digital value. That is chromatic adaptation. That is discounting the illuminant. And this is the final example, the gold and white, the black and blue dress. Some people see what's on the left, some people see what's on the right. It's all about our perception of where we think the illuminant is. If the illuminant's behind us, we see what's on the left. If the illuminant is behind the model, we see what's on the right because it's in shadow. And it's our interpretation of the scene. And I just want to make the point that we don't always get it right. And there I rest my case. That's the explanation there. And that's the end. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Mike. Really informative and beautifully illustrated talk. I always enjoy your talks, Mike, because you have such a professional and balanced way of presenting the material, which makes it very easy to follow. So thank you very much. There's a lot of people saying thank you in the chat, by the way.
I'm impressed. Thank you.
There was one person who asked a question very early on in the chat, which I want to put to you. Just I'm curious to see what you'll say about it. He said, how do we know when I see a colour and I call it red, that I'm seeing the same colour as you? I'm sure you've heard this question before.
Oh, many times.
So what would you like to say to it, Mike?
We don't know, but we can surmise that if we both have the same spectral responses, that we're actually seeing the same thing. But it is only an inference. It isn't a defined fact. It's just impossible to prove. I mean, we can do the measurements. We can measure the spectral reflectance. We can measure the eye response. And we could actually measure the brain response, and it looks the same. And so we could infer that it's the same. And highly likely it is. I mean, you could even, you could go out and paint a pillar box and send me the paint, and I paint a pillar box, and we would agree they're red pillar boxes. But we can't prove it. That's my answer to that. And I have a picture of an Irish pillar box, which I have used in a lecture to compare it. And I would say to people, well, here's your red pillar box. You look at it. When I see a pillar box, it looks like this. But then your pillar box is in England and my pillar box is in Ireland, because Irish pillar boxes are green.
Yeah.
So it's a good question. You need to think about it. It's philosophical.
Somebody else, by the way, in the chat said you have a very good voice for giving a talk. I think you could have a career in radio.
It's a bit late now.
If you're looking for another career, man.
Well, I enjoy doing it.
But one thing I enjoyed about your presentation, Mike, is that people might know I'm part of this thing called the Colour Literacy Project. And one of the things people are saying is that the old sort of triangle, which you showed at the very beginning, Mike, which is light, object, and an observer, which clearly there's some fundamental truth in that diagram, which is why it's persisted for so many years. But one of the things you showed quite nicely with your context of colour is the fact that that triangle is a very much a simplification of what's really going on. There's a lot more happening than that, and I thought some of your early slides were beautifully demonstrated it. So thank you very much.
Well, David Wright was my PhD supervisor in 1969 to 72, and he was a very good friend of mine. And he said to me then, and he's on record of saying it much earlier, that it's all very well to have CIE colorimetry and these tri-stimulus things, but they don't tell us what a color looks like. They don't say how red it is, how green it is, how blue it is. And so we've had to progress from there.
I didn't know that Wright was your supervisor, Mike. That's something I've learned.
Yeah, I was his penultimate PhD student.
Interesting.
1972, I graduated.
That's fantastic.
Robert Hunt was one of his first PhD students, which somebody's asking who it was. It was David Wright, Professor William David Wright, Imperial College. He did his PhD there in 1928. He devised the XYZ system of colorimetry, and he retired just after I'd done my PhD in 1973.
Now, Daniel's got a hand up. So do you want to ask your question directly, Daniel?
Yes, if you don't mind. Yeah. Do you have any other sources, or do you do any more talks on colour in interior design in reference to light, like how, I suppose, delving deeper into it, so less about the technical side of lighting and more about how, or is that just a whole degree on its own?
Well, it is. My background is in colour photography and colour imaging, digital imaging. I worked for Kodak for 28 years, and that's where I learnt my colour science. Since being involved with Derby and then Leeds, I've had to broaden my outlook. Most of the students I work with in Leeds are PhD students or master's students, and they're interested in the effect of colour on human perception. For example, we're doing a lot of work on the acceptability and preference for skin colour, because we have a big contract with L'Oreal, the cosmetics people, to do the work. In terms of design, branding, etc., I really know very little, partly because it's never had to cross my mind before, but that doesn't mean to say I can't talk about it. I'm just trying to think. Well, I think what I like to do is stimulate other people to think, and which is why I did this lecture the way I did it. It's the lecture I gave my students on color rendering, and I beefed it up a bit because I wanted to broaden it to try and appeal to textile people, which I think is important, because that's the name of the game. We're in the Department of Design, we're into textiles. So if you wanted me to talk about color and its impact, yeah, I can do it, but I do not have any direct knowledge. That's a convoluted answer.
Well, we have overrun a little bit, actually. We're meant to be only an hour, but there's a lot of interest and a lot of questions, Mike, but we probably should wrap it up. Otherwise our YouTube video would be too long. But I just want to say thank you very much again.
Yep.
If everybody with microphone turned on, they'd all be clapping as I'm clapping now. So thank you very much.
Thank you.